Wasn't that nifty how we slipped right into the description of how to look at handles? They just happen to be side by side in there, so now you know about how to look at handles, and that's very important. Another thing that you need to consider, if the pattern goes all the way under the piece. Chrysanthemum often does this. Several other patterns do this, and that adds a little bit of value if they didn't put a fan or they didn't put a Hobstar, but they continued the pattern all the way through. And all these little things, if they're pedestaled, if there's a teardrop in the stem, if the pattern goes under it, if there's extra handles, all of these things are very important. Now also look and see if the handle is straight. Sometimes the handles are attached at the time of manufacture at an angle. This detracts a tad, but not that much. Also, are the fans or the Hobstar points on the bottom of the piece equal distance from the edge, and do they meet in the center? That's important, and we are going to be talking more about that in future educational videos. Now, I don't mean to imply that you should go over this piece with a 10-power jeweler's loop. I tell you all these things, and most of them will be second nature to you. And if you've looked at enough glass, you know that to be true. But those of you who are new at this, you need to be aware of these things. I just want you to be aware of this piece that's in your hands. I want you to be totally in communication with it. Just make it part of you for a few moments and don't overlook anything about it. That's the whole idea. Now, at this point, you have read the price sticker, and perhaps at the same time you read the price sticker, you also saw that the piece is signed. If you can't find the signature and you're holding the piece, ask the proprietor to show you where it's signed. Now, most all of the books have pictures of all the signatures, and you should get familiar with those. The signature shouldn't be blurry. It should be crisp and sharp and distinct, and it should be very legible, and if it's not, it's something to be concerned with. One other thing, if the piece happens to be a wood polished piece and it's signed, then take a little extra time to look at it a little carefully, because you recall in our study of acid polish, we also learned that that's about the same time they started signing the pieces, they started doing the acid polish, and the majority of the signed pieces are acid polished. Now, in our opinion, signatures represent the most overrated aspect of glass collecting. And I want you to take a minute and look at an excerpt back from video number 1 2 years ago, when we told you just how important, or in other words, how unimportant signatures truly are. So let's look at this for a moment. Questions that people often ask in the booth, besides how come yours is bright and shiny and mine isn't, is when you say it's signed, where do they sign it? I mean, it's coast to coast. People ask the same question in the same wording and everything. And I often ask them why it's important. And they say, oh, I've got a dozen pieces at home and I can't find signatures on them. Well, I remind those folks that probably only about 4% of the glass was ever signed, which means 96% isn't signed. I also remind people that as far as value added to a piece of glass, a signature, to me, is like taking an airplane trip and they served you lunch. You got something thrown in for the price of the ticket. As is often the case, the piece doesn't necessarily stand up to real stern examination. Just because it's signed doesn't make it wonderful. Each piece has to stand alone as to quality and cut and clarity of blank and polish and everything in order for it to be a high quality piece. If it's signed in addition to all of these things, then that's an extra bonus. Now, when you go to sell a piece, if you can say, I have a certain piece in a certain pattern and it is signed, that may add to the value at that time. It certainly will make it easier to identify. Many beginning collectors like to know things are signed because it puts them at ease as to when it was made, where it was made. They can go to the library and read about that particular company and so forth. But one of the things that people don't realize is that Dorflinger and Libby and Hawks and all of them made offers in magazines and newspapers that if you broke one part of, say, a water set like this, all you had to do was send one good tumbler to them and they would make it. Okay. Invariably, they would sign that one piece. So years later, we may find something that's in a patented pattern by one company with a signature from another company on one of the tumblers. This happens quite frequently, and that's the explanation for it. In some of the companies, for instance, in the case of Libby, the least educated person in the factory made the decisions on signing. It's our understanding from talking to some of the old employees that the man back in the shipping room with crates and Excelsior packing this glass for Marshall Fields and wherever was the guy who decided what was going to be signed. He was the least talented person on the premises. If his instructions were to sign every 15th piece, he didn't gather all 15 pieces on a table and study them and say, now this one is a little better than that one's a little better than the next one. He just counted to 15. That was his only requirement, to be able to drive a nail, put Excelsior around the pieces, and count to 15. And he hit it with the acid stamp. So that doesn't necessarily mean that that piece is better than number 14 or number 13. Therefore, that's my answer to people when they ask about signatures. They're wonderful, and they're helpful to beginning collectors, and they do make them feel more comfortable. But most of your major collections in this country, except for the pieces after the turn of the century, most of those collections have very few signed pieces. Many of our advanced collectors tend to lean more toward the early pieces that were wood polished. Another problem with signatures is about the same time they learned to sign, about 1897, 98, they learned to do two of the big shortcuts in the production that we've talked about some this evening, and we'll get into more in future videos. That of the figured blank and that of the acid polish. Now, not that acid is a drawback, but acid was a change in the production. And in the early days, it wasn't as nice and as well polished and as well rinsed as it could have been. Therefore, people who zero in on just signed pieces are often people who end up with a collection full of shortcut pieces, figured blank pieces, pieces with acid residue, and etc. So think twice. Be sure the piece stands alone. Be sure it's a piece that you would like to have on your shelf, whether it's signed or not. And then, if it is signed, you got a little extra bonus, just like that airplane trip. Folks,